want it to end in about an hour. Would that be about right?
Yeah, and I'll come up and help with the Q&A, maybe just keep an eye on who the next
All right.
question is.
Fine.
Yeah, we pass mics around because we're recording in
Good.
podcast.
Good.
And, you know, we can continue as long as we can.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to find your seats, we'll get started with this evening's program. So, welcome to Cantini. My name is Paul Herbert. I'm the director of the museum, and I think I could close my eyes, pick somebody out of the audience, and have them come up here and do this introduction. Nevertheless, I feel obligated to do what I always do. This is the historic estate of the late Colonel Robert R. McCormick, longtime owner and publisher and editor of the Chicago Tribune, who, second only to the Tribune in his heart, was the 1st Division of the U.S. Army in which he served as a citizen soldier in World War I. The place is named Cantini because that was the little village north of Paris in France where the 1st Division fought America's first battle of World War I. And like a lot of veterans, he came home from the war transformed. He never forgot it, and he named the estate Cantini to honor the battle. And he was devoted to America's soldiers and service members and veterans for the rest of his life. He would hold reunions of the Society of the 1st Division here on the grounds. He founded Legion posts. When the Second War came, he guaranteed every employee of the Chicago Tribune Company a job when he returned from service and kept that promise to everybody who called him on it. So that's why there is a 1st Division Museum on Cantini, and how we fit with the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, our parent organization whose offices are down on Michigan Avenue. Colonel McCormick was dedicated to our democracy. An important part of democracy is an informed and engaged citizenry. And in that vein, we offer these evening lectures. If we, the people, are going to be responsible for our common defense, then we have to know something about it. And so we try to bring a lot of speakers through here throughout the year that have different perspectives on military affairs and military history. None more distinguished than this evening's speaker, Dr. Louis Sorley. Dr. Sorley has been a soldier. He's been a civilian of the Central Intelligence Agency. He's a graduate of the United States Military Academy. He has a PhD from Johns Hopkins University, and he has served on the faculties of the United States Military Academy and also of the U.S. Army War College. He has served in tank and armored cavalry units in Germany, in Vietnam, in the United States, and he's worked in the offices of the Secretary of Defense and the Chief of Staff of the Army. He is probably best noted, although not solely noted, as a historian and author, particularly of the Army, and has a number of very well-regarded books to his credit, including Thunderbolt, General Creighton Abrams and the Army of His Times, a biography of General Creighton Abrams, Honorable Warrior, General Harold K. Johnson and the Ethics of Command. Many of you may recognize General Johnson's name as the officer who was Chief of Staff of the Army through most of the Vietnam years. These are prize-winning books. A Better War, The Unexamined Victories and Final Tragedy of America's Years in Vietnam, which was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. Many, many other works. I'm not going to read them all. And editor of others that are very important to the understanding of American military history. What brings him here tonight, and for those of you who were here with us last week when Tom Ricks spoke on his book, The Generals, which is a critique of American generalship since World War II, Continuing on that theme, what brings him here tonight is his most recent biography, Westmoreland, the General Who Lost Vietnam. And so the position of this work, I think, is obvious from the title. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Louis Sorley.
I want to say that you're the first introducer in many years that I've been doing this who's made his way through all those complicated subtitles without an error. Congratulations. Thanks for coming. I've been here before. It's a wonderful forum, and I'm grateful for the privilege of visiting it again. You can't stand up here at this podium and not be conscious of all those imposing figures looking over your shoulder, so I'll tell you not to take anything away from Colonel McCormick or his colleagues in the war. On the day that the armistice was announced, my grandfather had his regiment on board ship in Hoboken Harbor preparing to sail to the war. And in our family, we maintained that when the Kaiser heard that Sorley's regiment was on the way, he knew it was time to give up. Well, as you know, we're going to talk tonight about the life and career of General Westmoreland. Probably I don't have to tell you this, but I warn you at the outset that it is not a happy story. But I think it is an important, even an essential one. My contention is that unless and until we understand William Charles Westmoreland, we will never fully understand what happened to us in Vietnam or why. And Westmoreland's is overwhelmingly a Vietnam story. His involvement in the Vietnam War was the defining aspect of his life. He himself perceived that and was driven for the rest of his days to characterize, explain, rationalize, and defend that role. His memoirs reflect the fixation. In a long career, totaling 36 years as an officer and a string of postings to increasingly important assignments, the 4 years he commanded American forces in Vietnam and the aftermath constitute virtually the entirety of his account. All the rest, a meager tenth. Understanding Westmoreland is not easy. He turns out to be a surprisingly complex man, fueled by ambition, driving himself relentlessly, of impressive military mien, energetic and effective at self-promotion, and skillful in cultivating influential sponsors. From his earliest days of service, he led his contemporaries, was admired and advanced by his seniors, and progressed rapidly upward. But few who served with him would claim they really knew this distant and difficult man. General Walter Kirwan, who was Westmoreland's chief of staff for a year in Vietnam, recalled that, although they worked very closely together, he and Westmoreland never had a personal relationship, never even, he said, a normal conversation, as colleagues ordinarily would. You couldn't get to him, Kirwan remembered, friendship and that kind of thing. Westmoreland also had an extraordinary capacity for polarizing the views of those who encountered him. Few remained indifferent. His executive officer, when Westmoreland was Army Chief of Staff, described him as the most gracious and gentlemanly person with whom I ever served. And an executive officer Westmoreland had in Vietnam regarded him as the only man to whom the term great could be applied that he had ever met. There were others, though, many others, who had a darker view. Among the most prominent was General Harold K. Johnson, a man of surpassing decency and goodwill. "I don't happen to be a fan of General Westmoreland," said Johnson. "I don't think I ever was, and I certainly didn't become one as a result of the Vietnam War or later during his tenure as Chief of Staff of the Army." And a general officer of another service who had been with Westmoreland in Vietnam described him as awed by his own magnificence. Westmoreland was born and raised in semi-rural South Carolina, near Spartanburg, where his father was manager of a textile mill. An Eagle Scout at age 15, president of his high school class, first captain at West Point, Westmoreland was encouraged from his earliest days to think of himself as specially gifted and especially privileged. His father wrote to Westmoreland during his plebe year at West Point, "You do not know how happy and proud it makes us all to know that you're making good," said his father. "Even the small boys and the Negroes are interested and proud of it." In another letter, the father said, "When you need anything, write me and I will send it to you. There is nothing too good for you." And a subsequent letter, still during Westmoreland's plebe year, went even further. "The people here, white and black, think you are about the biggest man in the country," reported his father. "Roosevelt has no rank at all compared to you. They really believe you will be president of the U.S. someday and talk this among themselves." Now, I think in the interest of full disclosure, I did not receive any such letters from my father when I was a plebe. Westmoreland entered World War II as commander of an artillery battalion in the 9th Infantry Division, taking his unit into combat in North Africa. There, they performed with distinction, earning a Presidential Unit Citation. Then, in Sicily, Westmoreland served temporarily under then Brigadier General Maxwell Taylor, an association that would be extremely important to him throughout the rest of his career. After Sicily, for the rest of World War II, Westmoreland served as a staff officer. After the war, back in the United States, he was able to get an assignment to the 82nd Airborne Division where, after attending jump school, he had a year in command of a parachute infantry regiment and then 3 years as division chief of staff. I read an earlier biography of General Westmoreland in which it was said that the only military formal schooling he had ever had was a 4-week course in mess management taught by the Army Cooks and Bakers School in Hawaii when he was a lieutenant. So we have to amend that. He did go to parachute school after the war. Then, late in the Korean War, Westmoreland took command of the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team. That unit constituted the Theater Reserve and consequently was stationed in Japan and periodically deployed to Korea. I was surprised to learn in the course of research that although Westmoreland commanded that outfit for 15 months, 9 of those months were spent in Japan, where after he was promoted to brigadier, he was able to live with his wife Kitsi and their young first child, this is during the Korean War, and 6 months in Korea. During one such Korean period, when they were not in combat, Westmoreland, who was desirous of qualifying for the Master Parachutist badge, made 13 jumps in one day. After the Korean War, new Brigadier General Westmoreland experienced his first Pentagon duty with an assignment in personnel. "I had not served there earlier, and I didn't want to serve there," he said in an oral history. Then Maxwell Taylor became Army Chief of Staff and rescued Westmoreland from the personnel policy morass, making him his Secretary of the General Staff. 2 years later, having in the meantime been promoted to 2-star rank, Westmoreland was rewarded by Taylor with command of the 101st Airborne Division. 2 years as commander of that division were followed by a 3-year assignment as superintendent of the United States Military Academy at West Point, then promotion to lieutenant general, and 6 months in command of the 18th Airborne Corps. He is now positioned for the, as I've described it, the central experience of his life. Westmoreland was sent to Vietnam in January 1964 as deputy to General Paul Harkins. Then in June of that year, replaced him as commander, U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, beginning what turned out to be a 4-year stint in that post. In the spring of 1965, the United States began deploying ground forces to Vietnam. Under Westmoreland, who decided to conduct a war of attrition, these forces concentrated almost entirely on large unit search and destroy operations, primarily in the deep jungle. Fixated on these large unit operations, called by many the War of the Big Battalions, Westmoreland largely ignored other key responsibilities, most importantly, the upgrading of South Vietnam's military forces and dealing with pacification. His way of war did nothing to affect the situation in South Vietnam's hamlets and villages, where the enemy's covert infrastructure was thus left free to continue using coercion and terror to dominate the rural populace. Meanwhile, Westmoreland deprived the South Vietnamese of modern weaponry, giving U.S. and other allied forces priority for issue of the new M16 rifle and other advanced military wherewithal. The South Vietnamese thus went for years, equipped with cast-off World War II vintage U.S. equipment, while being outgunned by the communists, who were provided the great AK-47 assault rifle and other advanced equipment by their backers. This next point I consider particularly important, and I flag it for your attention. It is important to know that it was left to Westmoreland to devise his own approach to conduct of the war. The conventional view of the war, even now, is that it was micromanaged from Washington. There are many stories of how, at Lyndon Johnson's White House so-called Tuesday lunches, he and other top, mostly civilian officials, even selected individual bombing targets and made other such detailed determinations about aspects of the war. Those accounts are accurate, but the decisions involved had to do with actions taken outside South Vietnam. Within South Vietnam, the U.S. commander had very wide latitude in deciding how to fight the war. This was true for Westmoreland and equally true for his eventual successor. General Bruce Palmer, Jr., another four-star who was incidentally a West Point classmate of Westmoreland's, confirmed this fact. Westmoreland, he said, Washington, he said, never made any basic decisions on the strategic concept, and that left Westmoreland in Vietnam to invent his own strategic concept, which he did. This was not, Palmer concluded, a good thing. There were many weaknesses in this strategy which in numerous interrelated ways played into the hands of the enemy. For one, said General Palmer, chasing around the countryside was futile. General Philip Davidson, Westmoreland's chief intelligence officer, said that Westmoreland's interest always lay in the big unit war. Pacification bored him. And, said Davidson, the search and destroy operations favored by Westmoreland accomplished little in providing the secure environment which pacification required. The measure of merit in a war of attrition is body count. Westmoreland underestimated the enemy's staying power, calculating that if he can inflict enough casualties on the communists, they would lose heart and cease their aggression against South Vietnam. Instead, the enemy proved willing to absorb enormous losses and still keep fighting. Thus, the progress, Westmoreland claimed, in racking up huge body counts did nothing to win the war. The enemy simply kept sending more and more replacements to make up his losses. Westmoreland was on a treadmill. Westmoreland also overestimated the American people's patience and tolerance of friendly losses. On a visit to South Vietnam, Senator Hollings from Westmoreland's home state of South Carolina was told by Westmoreland, "We're killing these people, the enemy, at a ratio of 10 to 1. Said Hollings, "Westy, the American people don't care about the 10. They care about the 1. But Westmoreland never seemed to grasp the significance of that. His response to any problem was to request more troops. The result was a buildup of a U.S. contingent of ground forces that eventually reached well over 500,000 men. But when the troop requests kept coming, with no evident progress in winning the war, Washington's patience ran out. In the spring of 1967, Westmoreland asked for 200,000 more troops, but got only a fraction of that amount. And then when, in the wake of the enemy's 1968 Tet Offensive, Westmoreland claimed a great victory and then asked for 206,000 more troops, a request he then spent years denying he had ever made, he got just token forces and was soon on his way home, replaced in Vietnam by his deputy. It is clear that Westmoreland thought he could take the war over from the South Vietnamese, bring it to a successful conclusion, then hand their country back to them and go home in glory. Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker saw that this was the case, concluding that when the United States first got involved, the political and psychological nature of the war was not understood. And he said, because we didn't understand it, our military thought we could get in and do the job and get out much more quickly than proved to be the case. Therefore, he added, Ambassador Bunker, I think that's one reason we were slow in training the Vietnamese instead of starting really to train them in an intensive way when we first went in there. General Fred Wyand, who was then on the scene commanding a Corps-level headquarters, saw the results at firsthand. The reason why some South Vietnamese units, he said, never operated at any distance from their fortified bases was that they were quite literally surrounded by a strong but well-hidden enemy, and these lightly armed, understrength South Vietnamese units simply did not have the capability to deal with them. Another American ambassador of the time, General Maxwell Taylor, was even more blunt. We never really paid attention to the ARVN Army, he said. We didn't give a damn about them. It was not until General Creighton Abrams came on the scene that this attitude changed. Everyone knows about the Tet Offensive of 1968 and how significant that was. It's important to know also that 1967, the year before, was a fateful time in Westmoreland's Vietnam service. During that year, he made 3 trips to the United States, where in public appearances he gave very optimistic assessments of how the war was going, part of what later came to be called the Johnson administration's progress offensive. Very, very encouraged, said Westmoreland in a Plainside press conference upon arriving in the U.S. in mid-November. I've never been more encouraged during my entire almost 4 years in country. At the National Press Club, he asserted that we have reached an important point where the end begins to come into view. And, he added, the enemy's hopes are bankrupt. On another visit that year, he spoke to a joint session of Congress, rendering another optimistic report and being so taken with the experience that he later described it as the most memorable moment in his military career and his finest hour, which gave him the greatest personal satisfaction. I will have to say that as a soldier myself, I find it very saddening that a soldier who reached such heights as he did, would find a political event his most satisfying experience. 1967 was also a time of vigorous debate about the enemy's order of battle, which means simply his strength and organization. Westmoreland denied senior civilian officials accurate data by imposing a ceiling on the number of enemy forces his intelligence officers could report or agree to, and by personally removing from the order of battle entire categories that had long been included, thus falsely portraying progress in reducing enemy strength. Challenged by newsmen on his optimistic pronouncements, Westmoreland resorted to his familiar reliance on body count. "We are bleeding him a great deal more than he is bleeding us," he said. In May 1967, Westmoreland was sent a new deputy, an officer who was slated to take over the top command from him within a matter of weeks. This is in May of 1967. As events played out, however, that did not happen then, and it was 13 months before it did. Westmoreland sought to portray 1967 as a triumphant year, one during which he was winning the war. Others, many others, saw it much differently. By May of 1967, President Johnson was referring to the war as a bloody impasse. In early November 1967, the President told the wise men, his group of outside advisors on war policy, that we'd been on dead center for the last year in Vietnam. General Bruce Plummer, Jr., then serving as Deputy Commanding General of the U.S. Army Vietnam, told Westmoreland's incoming four-star deputy that he really had basic disagreements with Westy on how it was organized and how we were doing it. And later, General Palmer elaborated. "It was just a mess," he said. "We were losing and trying to put it together, and it just wasn't working. There wasn't anything that was working." By the end of 1967, remembered Nicholas Katzenbach, a grim sense of siege was descending on the White House. Finally, even General William Depew, architect of the search and destroy approach to the war, had admitted that it was a losing concept of operation. "We ended up," he said, after it was all over, "with no operational plan that had the slightest chance of ending the war favorably." In the face of this united opposition to his way of war and the widespread negative view of what it was achieving, Westmoreland continued to maintain, then and later, that the North Vietnamese in mid-1967 were in a position of weakness. Commenting on President Lyndon Johnson, military historian Russell Weigley observed that no capable war president would have allowed an officer of such limited capacities as General Westmoreland to command in Vietnam for so long. It is sad to report to you that over the course of these years and later, Westmoreland racked up a lengthy record of false, misleading, and inaccurate statements or omissions, ranging from enemy order of battle to his troop requests, from the situation in Vietnam to closure of Khe Sanh Base, and from battles in the Ia Drang to prediction of an early end of the war to light at the end of the tunnel. Some of these matters were petty, others of crucial importance, but they were alike in one respect. When Westmoreland saw his personal interests at stake, he did not hesitate to conceal or abandon the truth. When, at the end of January 1968, the enemy's Tet Offensive began, Westmoreland's long turn at bat was nearing an end. The Tet resurgence of enemy forces led many to conclude that, in his optimistic forecasts of the previous year, Westmoreland had either not known what he was talking about or he had not leveled with the American people. It is hard to know which is the more devastating criticism. What was clear, however, was that with his unavailing approach to conduct of the war, Westmoreland had squandered 4 years of support by much of the American people, the Congress, and even the media. For the next 4 years, Westmoreland served as Army Chief of Staff. The Army of that day was struggling with many problems, some the result of the ongoing war in Vietnam, others more societal in origin. These included indiscipline, widespread drug abuse, racial disharmony, budgetary shortfalls, and the necessity to prepare for the end of the draft and transition to an all-volunteer force. Faced with these multiple crises, Westmoreland decided to focus his attention elsewhere. I spoke in every State of the Union, he later recalled. I consider myself the military spokesman of the Army, and that I should be exposed to the American public and put forth the Army's point of view. I felt that an understanding of the military was the primary mission that fell on my shoulders while I was Chief of Staff. And then he said, I had too much to occupy me to get into details of such matters as Army reorganization. I frankly, in evaluating the priorities of my time, gave high priority to going around the country and giving them the facts of life with respect to the military. In later years, Westmoreland viewed himself as very much put upon. My years away have been fraught with challenges, frustrations, and sadness, he said to a hometown audience. Nobody has taken more guff than I have, and I am not apologizing for a damn thing, nothing, and I welcome being the point man. That outlook, no second guessing of himself and no regrets, persisted through the end of his life. As Army Chief of Staff and beyond, Westmoreland made strenuous efforts to shape the historical record in ways favorable to his version of reality. This included writing his memoirs. Charles McDonald, a professional military historian, was the ghostwriter for that project. He was dismayed that Westmoreland insisted on producing an account like Eisenhower's crusade in Europe, and didn't let the fact that he'd lost his war keep him from doing so. Wrote Westmoreland self-pityingly, as American commander in Vietnam, I underwent many frustrations, endured much interference, lived with countless irritations, swallowed many disappointments, bore considerable criticism. Well, yes. 2 major episodes, both extremely traumatic, marked the Westmoreland retirement years. First was a dramatically unsuccessful campaign for governor in his native state of South Carolina, and then there was a failed libel suit against the CBS television network for a documentary charging Westmoreland with manipulation of enemy strength figures while he commanded U.S. forces in Vietnam. In each of these cases, Westmoreland ignored the advice of highly placed people who had his best interests at heart and who counseled against the courses of action Westmoreland took. In 1982, when CBS television aired the documentary that charging Westmoreland with having manipulated reports of enemy strength during the Vietnam War, this was a sensation. Westmoreland had willingly participated in making the program, being interviewed on camera, and incidentally asking to be paid for it. He was not. The resulting broadcast was not favorable to him, with numerous former intelligence officers describing how enemy strength data had been manipulated and how Westmoreland himself had decreed that certain whole categories of enemy forces be taken out of the order of battle, thus artificially driving down the total of enemy forces so as to achieve progress in his war of attrition. In due course, rejecting the counsel of high-powered attorneys who advised against it, Westmoreland brought a libel suit against CBS seeking $120 million in damages. In the course of a lengthy trial, with Westmoreland represented by an attorney who had never before tried a case in court, things did not go well. Still, the thing dragged on for some 18 weeks, and then just days before the case would have gone to the jury, Westmoreland withdrew his suit. In exchange, he received a vanilla statement from CBS which he claimed exonerated him. The effort to defame, dishonor, and destroy me and those under my command had been exposed and defeated, he asserted. I therefore withdrew from the battlefield, all flags flying. Editorial opinion was not so favorable. The New York Times succinctly stated the prevailing reaction. At the end, it concluded, General Westmoreland stood in imminent danger of having a jury confirm the essential truth of the CBS report. For in court, as on the original program, the general could not get past the testimony of high-ranking former subordinates who confirmed his having colored some intelligence information. Said one of the jurors to the press on the way out of the courtroom, the courthouse door, the evidence in favor of CBS was overwhelming. I'm almost at the end, and I would like to suggest this. It seems very clear to me that Westmoreland's ultimate failure would have earned him more compassion had he not personally been so fundamentally to blame for the endless self-promotion that elevated him to positions and responsibilities beyond his capacity. It's the aggressive guy who gets his share plus, Westmoreland maintained, adding, that principle applies to most anything, and that's the way he operated. In later years, Westmoreland, widely regarded as a general who lost his war, also lost his only run for political office, lost his libel suit, and lost his reputation. It was a sad ending for a man who for most of his life and career had led what seemed to be a charmed existence. General Westmoreland lived a long life, afflicted by Alzheimer's disease for at least his last decade. He died in July 2005 and was buried at West Point in a gravesite he had selected when he was superintendent there. As a final irony, given Westmoreland's very strong and vocal opposition to the admission of women to West Point, the Cadet Honor Guard for the burial ceremony was commanded, and very ably, by a female cadet. Thank you very much. You're going to stage manage this, yes?
Pardon?
You're going to stage manage the Q&A, yes?
I'm going to stay, yeah. We've got time for some Q&A, and please wait until one of the folks on the side of the microphone comes up, and we'll start with the gentleman right here. Wait for the mic.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You outlined several strategies that led to, of the commanding general, that led to disaster and defeat in Vietnam. In your view, what strategies would have led to victory in Vietnam? You could outline a couple.
Thank you very much. That introduces my next one-hour lecture. I know I must be brief, but it's difficult. I draw your attention to two other books, also by me. One, Colonel Herbert referred to, is called Better War. And the Better War, the title is drawn from a quotation from a journalist for the New Yorker who served in Vietnam for a number of years. And after General Westmoreland had been succeeded by General Creighton Abrams, this writer said, you know, it's too bad. Abrams is very good. He deserves a better war. I quoted that to General Abrams' eldest son, who was then on the faculty at Fort Leavenworth, also Creighton Abrams, and without a moment's hesitation, he said, referring to his father, he said, he didn't see it that way. He thought the Vietnamese were worth it. Now, General Abrams had been Vice Chief of Staff of the Army for 3 years the first 3 years that Westmoreland commanded in Vietnam. The Chief of Staff of the Army was General Harold K. Johnson. The Vice Chief was Abrams from 64 to 67. Early in the war, General Harold K. Johnson, who was a distinguished combat veteran himself, thought that the way the war was being conducted was totally wrong. And he cranked up a study very early on, even before the first of the ground forces reached Vietnam in the spring and summer of 1965. And this study goes as the PROVN study, P-R-O-V-N, and that's short for Program for the Pacification and Long-Term Development of Vietnam. This was briefed all around. It was briefed to Westmoreland. Westmoreland, of course, rejected it out of hand because PROVN said what Westmoreland is doing is not working and it cannot work, and the reason it can't work is it's ignoring the war in the hamlets and villages, where, as I mentioned, the enemy's covert infrastructure was dominating the population using terror and coercion. So nothing happened with respect to PROVN until General Abrams takes command. General Fred Wyand then said the tactics changed within 15 minutes of Abrams taking command. And what he began to do, with the great cooperation of two other wonderful public servants, Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker, who headed our embassy, and Ambassador William Colby, who headed our program of support for the South Vietnamese pacification program, they said, this has got to be one war, one war. We can't ignore these other important things anymore. So that war is going to be, yes, continuation of combat operations, but much changed. No longer these big multi-battalion, multi-division sweeps in the deep jungle, but hundreds, if not thousands, of patrols and ambushes sited to protect the population, so the enemy has to come through you to get to the population, which is the real goal of this war. And we're going to build up the South Vietnamese armed forces. We give them the M16 rifle and other things, so they're not out there with their little pop guns of carbines and things that some of you have carried. And we're going to get into the pacification program and root out that infrastructure. This did work much, much better. One of the, I'm almost finished this answer. One of the icons of the war, for people who know the history, was a man named John Paul Vann, who served there for many years, mostly in the pacification program. And in January of 1972, he said, this war has never been going better than now. He said, the roads are open and the bridges are up, and you run much more chance of being harmed by the hustling, bustling Lambrettas and Land Rovers than you do from the Viet Cong. The enemy obviously saw that too, because only a short time later they launched their Easter Offensive of 1972. We had withdrawn almost all our forces. Just as I said, they'd built up during the Westmoreland years, we withdrew them unilaterally during the Abrams years. So by this time in the spring of 1972, about all he has left to work with is air power and some naval gunfire support to help the Vietnamese. Well, it was a pitched battle. Initially, the enemy made some serious inroads. The Vietnamese pushed them back, and they were doing fine. Some people said, well, they couldn't have done it without our air support, and Abrams wouldn't hear of it. He said, if some of the Vietnamese, large numbers of them that had not stood and fought, 10 times the air power we had would not have carried the day. So in January of 1973, the so-called Paris Accords are signed, theoretically ending the war. We are obliged to withdraw our forces. We do. We had promised the Vietnamese 3 things if they would sign those accords, because they were mortally afraid of what the results would be. We said that if the fighting was resumed, we would reintroduce combat power to punish the enemy for doing that. We're talking, I think, B-52s. Secondly, if the Vietnamese suffered losses of major combat systems, tanks, artillery, aircraft, we would replace those on a one-for-one basis, as was provided for in the Paris Accords. And thirdly, we would maintain a robust level of financial support for the foreseeable future. I am sorry to tell you that when it came to the crunch, we defaulted on all 3 of those commitments. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese were getting greatly increased support from their patrons, the Soviet Union and China. And as my friend Tom Polgar, the last CIA chief of station, Saigon, said in one of his last cables, outcome no longer in doubt, because South Vietnam cannot sustain itself without our support so long as the enemy is getting increasing support from his patrons. End of message, end of war.
Right over here. And the microphone, please.
Staff Sergeant R.C. Collins. You'll forgive the emotion.
You want a blanket absolution before you nail me, right?
No. You've made much of June of 1967. Several things happened in 1967 that I remember quite clearly. One was the death of my best friend. Another was my own draft notice. Another was Westmoreland taking charge in Vietnam. And another was the Life magazine issue dated June 12th, 1964. In this magazine, the war in Vietnam is clearly shown to be a failure. Everything that you have said was pointed out in 1964. We were fighting an enemy that was highly motivated, resolute, tough. We had as allies people who were unmotivated, disloyal, and unwilling to fight. And yet, 17 boys who served with me in basic training have names inscribed on the Vietnam Memorial Wall now. Everything in this magazine article is true. Everything in this magazine article is exactly, sir, what you have said. It said that we were losing the war, that the people of South Vietnam were not on our side, that the North Vietnamese were winning the Battle of the Hamlets. Sir?
Your question for the speaker, sir?
My question, sir. Having spoken to a dear friend who's somewhat senior to me before coming tonight, he said that he was at a staffing in 1967, and one of the senior majors there put on his hat, closed his briefcase, and proceeded to leave the staffing, and he was asked why, and he said, well, because we've apparently killed everybody in North Vietnam. The war must be over. My question is why?
I think you want me to comment on your comments. Is that not correct?
My question is, we knew in 1964, Westmoreland knew in 1967, yet why did we pursue this? Why did we kill 52,000 boys in Vietnam? How did this go on so long?
Okay, I got your question. Thank you.
Thanks.
Let me borrow your magazine too, if I may, please. I haven't seen this for a while. This is my West Point classmate and close friend, Bob Bacon, walking across a field with the Vietnamese that he was advisor to. A blow-up of this, probably as big as the front of this podium, was at the top of the escalator on the third floor of the Pentagon outside the Secretary of the Army's office for half a decade or more. And we would see it every day that we came through there. I guess to be short in my response to your comments, which I respect as heartfelt, and we have all lost friends, all those who served have lost friends, I would say just a few quick things. The first thing is what Life magazine may have concluded in 1964, before we put troops into Vietnam, and while General Westmoreland was the commander, is one thing. And I have tried to illustrate how later, under a different commander and with a different understanding of the nature of the war and how to conduct it, that war went much better. The part of your comments with which I would most like to take issue, sir, and I do so respectfully, is your characterization of the South Vietnamese. As I was at pains to illustrate, they did not perform very well when we gave them crap left over from World War II to fight the enemy armed with AK-47s and the best infantry weapons then available. And when Westmoreland went home and Abrams took command, they began to get the comparable weaponry. In the earlier period, they were ineffective for the reasons I said. Their morale was low for the same reason. And very important, their reputation was damaged as well, because people back in the United States didn't know what the underlying reasons for that were. In the latter stages of the war in Vietnam, and this is pretty clear, the government of Vietnam, South Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, was reasonably effective. Now, I will have to say, I come to you from Potomac, Maryland, and near the city of Washington, D.C., where at last check, 50% of the city council were either under indictment or under investigation. So my basis for comparison may be a little suspect. Pretty good, a pretty good government, a pretty good armed forces, and a pretty unified populace. And I think we only have to look at what happened after the fall of Saigon. 1 million boat people, 40 or 50,000 killed, hundreds of thousands others put in so-called re-education camps where many remained for as long as 15, 16, 17 years. To know that the people of South Vietnam in large measure did not want to live under the communists, and they fought hard to keep that from happening. I commend a new book, and maybe you'd like to invite this gentleman, you probably already have. The author's name is Jay Veith, V-E-I-T-H, and the book is called Black April, which sounds like the last month of the year, but it's really the last 2 years of the war after we basically bailed out, and he tells you how heroically the South Vietnamese conducted themselves then. So I do want to say again, I respect your pain for the losses you described. I can tell you I feel the same way about that part, and so do all people I know who served there. Thanks for bringing this.
Gentleman on the left here, please, and then we'll come back over to this side. The fellow in the first cab there.
Thank you. My name is Bob Sanski. I was a buck sergeant in the 2nd and 7th Cav in 67, 68. I've read information that indicates that Bob McNamara was sent by the president to Vietnam to review the results of LZ X-ray. And in a private communication to the president, indicated that there was only 2 choices in Vietnam, and that was November of 65. That we could either spend a lot of money and a lot of lives and lose, or get out now and lose. And I'd like to have your reflections and reaction to that statement.
As attributed to McNamara, is that what you're saying? Yes. Thank you. McNamara is, of course, a very interesting figure, as interesting in many ways as General Westmoreland. He remained incommunicado on his service in the Defense Department for many years. He was finally smoked out as a result of this libel suit that Westmoreland brought against CBS, and McNamara was compelled to testify. And that's when he told us for the first time publicly that possibly as early as 1965, he had lost faith in the possibility of a military victory in Vietnam. Now, I already gave too long an answer to the first question, and so I'm not going to return to that. I'll just tell you that a major difference between the Westmoreland approach to the conduct of the war, which is the more firepower the better, and we can just kill enough of the enemy, they'll quit, and the approach to the war that I've alluded to under Abrams and Bunker and Colby, in which building up the South Vietnamese and building up their infrastructure and building up their agriculture and their economy and many other things that most of us here, I think, would have to agree are not military in nature, were crucially important parts of winning that war. So no, not a military victory, at least by itself, but certainly military power to protect the people that were doing these other things. There was an officer who served in Vietnam mostly as a civilian for the remarkable period of 18 years. And he used to be the briefer when high-level visitors would come and they'd talk about pacification. And he would say, well, you can get different views as to whether pacification is 10% security or 90% security, but he says no one will argue that it's the first 10% or the first 90%. You can't conduct pacification with an NVA division in the backyard. So that's why I said this was a comprehensive approach across the war. I don't know what else to say about McNamara except to tell you one story, if this may be a little pertinent to the point you raised. I talked about how General Westmoreland was often untruthful or deceptive in the things that he said. Well, that was certainly true of the LBJ administration writ large, and it was certainly true about McNamara as well. And the way they ran the war from Washington was basically two events. They would have periodic conferences in some place like Honolulu, and people would come from Saigon and people would come from Washington, and they would spend 2 or 3 days in a seance there, and then they would announce various things and go on about their business. The other thing was that McNamara would make periodic visits to Saigon. And I don't have the exact number in my head, but I'm going to say he made a dozen or so such visits during the course of his part of the war. And here would be the drill. He'd go out and they would discuss increases in our troop strength. And Westmoreland would lay out a number. And there would be some jawboning. And then there would be, McNamara would decide. Quite often that number was lower than the number that had been proposed by Westmoreland in their discussions. And then Westmoreland would send a message in and he'd ask for the agreed figure. And then they would publicize that had been approved so that Lyndon Johnson, McNamara, Westmoreland, they could all say that the commander was getting everything he asked for. And so, you know, the commander's being supported to a fairly well. Well, yes and no. That kind of deception permeated just about all of the governmental actions at the higher levels in that part of the war in Vietnam. Not after that. General Abrams never asked for a single soldier, and he accommodated the progressive reduction of his forces in 14 increments down to practically nothing by the time of the Easter Offensive I talked about in '72. I'm not sure I did a very good job on your question, but I tried.
There was a question right here. Yeah.
She's coming.
I know a lot of these guys, but I mean, I feel bad that I didn't recognize Bob on the status coverage.
Yes, sir.
I was in Vietnam from June of '70 to January of '72. The question, did General Westmoreland, after he left, interfere with the pacification efforts in Vietnam?
Good question. Let me come at it this way. I have described how when he went back to be the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Westmoreland seemed to interest himself and occupy himself primarily with attempts to justify his period of service in Vietnam. And I mentioned going to speak in every state of the Union. I mentioned his memoirs, which came later, of course, after he retired. He published a report on the war in Vietnam as Chief of Staff. Of course, the war is still raging on, so it's a report on his piece of the war in Vietnam. In there, he does not mention friendly casualty figures even once, even though the security review guys pointed this out and said, you're going to be criticized, he wouldn't do it. And he commissioned a set of monographs on virtually all topics having to do with the war, except armor. He didn't put one on armor. And these were, of course, all about the war during his period of time, and the people writing them were under his command. So those were interesting things. The biggest influence on the war in Vietnam that General Westmoreland exerted that I am aware of, and it's hugely important and hugely negative, was this. after the administration's changed and Nixon becomes the president, he and Kissinger are, trying to figure a way out of this morass. And they decide that they're going to start withdrawing our forces unilaterally, and they begin doing that in July and August of 1969. They bring out, I think, 25,000 forces in that period. And then later in that year, October, November, December, another 40,500, and then they keep doing that in increments, as I said. Westmoreland, who is chief of staff, decrees that the troops who come out will not be the ones who are in the unit being withdrawn now. They'll be the ones everywhere in Vietnam that have been there the longest. He says that's the only fair way to do it. Okay, so we scarf up all the longest serving guys up to the number it takes to fill up, let's say, the 9th Infantry Division, which was one of the first ones to come out. And we take out an equivalent number of people, and we send that bunch home. So now all the other units in Vietnam have been stripped of their most experienced, longest serving people, and they've been infused with new people that don't know the people who are already there, don't know one another, and this is pretty bad. But then we do it a second time, and a third time, and a fourth time. And Abrams fights against this to his last gasp, but he loses, because Westmoreland's the chief of staff, and he can make this happen. General Don Starry, later a 4-star, was General Abrams' close hold planner for the first withdrawal increments. And he's told in his oral history about sitting up late the night this decision is finalized in Washington with Abrams. And Abrams said, Don, I won't live to see the end of this, but this will, trying to straighten out the harm this is going to do will occupy you for the rest of your career. And he said, indeed it did. Thanks.
We'll take one more question, and I think from back here.
He wants to make a comment. Yeah, comment, not a question, sir. With all due respect,
Short comment.
sir?
Maybe we do have questions. Short comment.
Okay, all right. You mentioned the crap that we gave the South Vietnamese Army for armaments. I was a light weapons infantryman with the 101st Airborne in the A Shaw Valley in 1968. I will tell you, I had the M16 fail me on 2 separate occasions, once for reliability and another one for knockdown power. The average, or most of the people that I was there with, would prefer to have the M14 or the M1, anything but the M16. We gave it very low marks as far as a weapon.
Well, that's good. That's a good comment, and there's an entire literature on that matter. I don't have time to go into it here, but I can talk to you afterward if you'd like. Very few people that, my opinion is very few people would have traded in their M16 for an M2 carbine of World War II vintage. The Vietnamese were eager to have them and glad to get them. And in most cases, when they did get them, their unit performance improved dramatically. And so while there were some problems, and you talked about, I believe you said in 1968, the Vietnamese didn't really start to get them until Abrams took over in June of '68. A few units got them before when he was the deputy. And so concurrent with their being armed in this way, some of those problems were, if not solved, they were ameliorated. There were problems with the powder, the kind of powder that was being used and other things like that. But let me just say this. You mentioned I had a stint on the faculty at the Army War College, and the deal was that faculty officers would be detailed to introduce guest speakers and then to moderate the Q&A that followed. And invariably, there would be someone who did not want to ask a question. He wanted to make a goddamn statement. And it was very interesting to see him try to twist this around somehow that it would be a question. And so I usually say when it's left to me, we welcome comments and questions, and I welcome yours. Thank you. Can we do one more question?
We can do one more question.
Yeah.
Let's go to the first hand I saw.
Excuse me, it's a question.
Oh, wait a minute.
Question,
You're
sir.
wrestling over the microphone, but you have a question. Okay.
All right. On how did Westmoreland survive when you had the Joint Chiefs, Johnson, and you had General Krulak telling LBJ that this was, you know, you're losing. And even McNamara, I guess.
I think you can stop right there. That's the question, isn't it?
What's the question? How'd they do it?
Yep. That's an absolutely crucial question, and I'm glad we managed to squeeze it in. I quoted historian Russell Wagley saying no competent war president would have kept Westmoreland, a man of such limited capacities as Westmoreland, in command for so long. And you have to wonder, why was that? And then, as I told you, in May of '67, Abrams was sent out as the deputy with a plan that within weeks he would take command, and instead it was 13 months before he did. Why did that happen? And I know for sure that that's true because Cyrus Vance, who was Deputy Secretary of Defense, told me that that was true. He said, we knew we had to get Abrams out there. Here's why. Can I have 3 minutes, please? Here's why I think it. Yeah. Well, that's fair enough. I mean, you know what voting with your feet means, and I understand that too. But the thing I think that kept Abrams from succeeding Westmoreland in May, June, or July of '67, which was, you know, before a lot of the Progress Offensive, before the Tet 68, a lot of things would have been different, I believe, was one of those McNamara visits. And McNamara goes out and has a seance. And on the last day, Westmoreland has to leave before the Secretary of Defense because his mother has died. So he goes back to the United States, and Abrams is with the Secretary. And McNamara liked to have press conferences. So did Westmoreland. And so McNamara would always have a press conference at the end of one of these Saigon visits before he got on the airplane to go home. And usually they were very unexceptionable. But the reporters always asked if there'd been any decisions about more troops being sent there. That was the hot button issue, of course. So on this occasion, they asked that, as always, and to their shock, McNamara gave them a really newsworthy answer. He said, this is a close paraphrase, before we talk about more soldiers, we've got to make better use of the soldiers we have here now. Well, that's a direct slap at Westmoreland, of course, and how he's using the forces that he has there. So this becomes a big blow-up, and Westmoreland, of course, back in the United States, after he takes care of his mother's funeral and all that, he goes to Washington, and basically he tells LBJ that, you know, that's not fair, and he shouldn't be treated that way. Well, Westmoreland more or less backs him. And people talk about Westmoreland's personality. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Lyndon Johnson more or less thank you. Lyndon Johnson more or less backs Westmoreland. And people talk about the LBJ personality and so on. And many people said he would not have relieved Westmoreland then because it would reflect on his LBJ's choice of him in the first place. Not a good choice, and he didn't want that to happen. And so, as we said, Westmoreland is out there for almost another year, over another year. So I think you've got these possibilities. The president can relieve him if he wants to. He's the commander-in-chief. He's got that reason for not doing it, plus which Lyndon Johnson knows nothing about military affairs. The next person in line is McNamara. He knows very little about military affairs. The next person in line, and the first military guy in line, is General Earl Wheeler, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he's essentially a staff officer with very little command experience and none in combat. And I think all three of those people lack confidence in their ability to judge Westmoreland and relieve him for cause. And by the way, Westmoreland's telling them all the time how he's winning. Well, he's not. He's not. We know that. So I think that's the problem. And not until there was a change of administration, where they didn't have any responsibility for the people who were there, then they can make this change. Do you want to quit here? Are we quitting now?
We're about to. Is there a closing
Yes. I have written 9 books, this being the most recent of those. I found it very enjoyable to write about Creighton Abrams, to write about Harold K. Johnson, to write about the course of the war in the latter years, even though we knew, how it's going to turn out. Can't change that. And I thought for a long time about this book because I knew this was not a happy story, and I did not look forward to writing it. But I had so much material about General Westmoreland that I had gained as a byproduct of research on earlier books that I had not seen published anywhere, which I thought might be important to us in trying to help us, as I said at the outset, understand what happened to us in Vietnam and why, that I finally decided I would undertake this. So I would like to say I'm proud of the outcome, although I can't really say I'm happy about it. I thank you all for coming, and especially those who are Vietnam veterans. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Bob. That was a terrific talk, and we appreciate all the dedication that it took to write those 9 books. That's certainly in the spirit of these conferences. A couple of quick notes. You've got evaluations on your chair, and we'd really appreciate it if you'd fill them out real quickly and put them on the table in the back. Let Dr. Sorley get to the table we have arranged for him because his book is for sale, and he'll be glad to talk more with you and sign books. But we'd like to get him back there rather than have him captured up here. This is our last event of the year. It's been a tremendous success. I thank every single one of you for coming. If this is your first event, I hope you'll come back. Take a look at our website. Our first event in 2013 will be in February. We're closed in the month of January to do housekeeping and maintenance and things like that, but we'll have a great program in 2013 as well. And J.D. Comas and Kara Allison, the 2 young folks in the back, are the people who run that, so you may want to say hi to them and thank them for all the work they do to put these programs together. These are free because Colonel McCormick was rich and he left his money to us. So I have the privilege of not having to hit you up for any money, but I would commend to you the Midwest Shelter for Homeless Veterans, named after Lance Corporal Nicholas Larson. Thank you. If you don't know about that wonderful institution, it's in Wheaton, it's grassroots, it's 501c3, it's first class, and our Legionnaires from Cantigny Post 556 have a red, white, and blue mailbox into which you can put a few bucks, and we'll make sure that those go to that institution, and you can pick up some literature so you know we're not spending it on our next fish fry. Let's see, I think those are all the announcements, but I do want to say one thing. I gave a talk a week or so ago and mentioned why do we honor our veterans, and Colonel McCormick set a standard for that here at Cantigny, and we carry it on. We honor all of America's veterans and service people. And what sets a veteran apart from many other professions that are life-threatening and require great sacrifice and great dedication is a veteran, whether he or she saw combat or not, no matter what they did, whether they served a couple years or 30 years, whatever they did, they took an oath. And the oath is legally binding. And the oath says, I will obey the orders of the President of the United States and the officers appointed over me, so help me God. And for the time that they're in service until they're honorably discharged, they're bound by that oath. And they never think about it. They don't talk about it. It's not a big deal in their daily lives. But it does bind them to do what we, the people, ask them, actually tell them, or our agents tell them to do. And sometimes the orders of the President can require unbelievable sacrifice. And those wonderful young men and women go off and do what we ask them to do. And that is a tremendous thing, and that is why we honor them. And it puts upon all of us as citizens and voters a tremendous responsibility to have the right people giving those orders and to be engaged ourselves and not just turn it over to the brass, because the brass and the Pentagon and all those institutions don't own the sons and daughters that we send to war. It is up to us, and it is in that vein that we have this series of lectures. So for all you vets, thank you. God bless you.